Hello, welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and in this episode, we do Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. From 1945 to, well, we'll see where it goes, but we're trying to get up to the modern age. So, this is probably going to be a longer episode because we've got a lot to cover. So, the Japanese invasion during the Second World War defeated the French. It showed the French were not so tough. But were the Vietnamese going to put up with Japanese control? Please. In 1941, the Viet Minh established itself as a nationalist party, a Vietnam for the Vietnamese. Marxism was part of this. It was seen as anti-French, but not necessarily pro-communist. Chiang Kai-shek in China had arrested Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh went to the United States for help. And General Giap, set up a Maoist, Mao Zedong-styled guerrilla war against the Japanese. So, Marxism was a populist socialism. It wasn't yet pro-communist, but Ho Chi Minh did have a relationship with both the CCP and the USSR, who we talked about. So the idea that it wouldn't fall into the Soviet camp after the Cold War, after the World War II, is kind of hoping too much. But remember, the United States and Soviet Union are allies during the Second World War. The Cold War was not an inevitability. So the choosing by the Viet Minh of Marxism was seen as anti-French, as a way of confiscating French plantations, rubber plantations, and French land. The Vietnamese emperor, remember him, was seen as pro-French. Of course he was pro-French. The French were taking care of him. I mean, the French had taken over the country in the 1880s, and they kept him in charge in order to kind of not run the show, but be a symbol of the show and keep the peace. So he got a nice lifestyle as long as the French were in charge. Well, the French got kicked out by the Japanese, or defeated. They weren't kicked out yet. They're defeated by the Japanese. The Japanese will use him as well to keep the peace, just like the French used him. And so he has to abdicate in 1945. The entire imperial government is just not going to work. It's just too allied. And it's a much more complicated story, but it's seen as too allied to the invaders. So nationalism is winning in 1945. A Vietnam for the Vietnamese. Well, that's what they argued for. That's what Ho Chi Minh argued for. A Vietnam for the Vietnamese. It could have been American allied. There is the possibility. Or at least kind of a Thai non-interventionalist. You know, hey, we want to be friends with China, Russia, and America all at the same time. A neutral in the Cold War. But the French want back in. Humiliated at their defeat, humiliated by the collaboration, humiliated that they had been defeated by the Japanese, humiliated again and again. There's a need for the French to show they're French. They're embarrassed in Europe. They need money to rebuild. There's all this racism. How could this happen to us? We're white people. How could these Asians defeat us? If we get kicked out of Asia, what does that mean for Africa? And so the UK and France will not give up their empires. We'll see this again with the UK and other places. And as the Cold War gets started, the Americans need the UK and the French to protect Europe. The United States didn't want to leave 10 million soldiers. There's no way the Americans were going to able to keep 10 million soldiers in the army after 1945. And so they were going to need the UK and France to help protect Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and protect Western Europe from a Russian invasion. And so if the UK and the French want to recreate their empires, and that will keep countries in a non-communist world, the U.S. gives in. Okay, there's a bunch of racism in there. There's economics. There's what's called realpolitik. But it's basically, you're with us, so we'll go with it. Well, that creates a war, right? The Viet Minh are not going to allow the French to come back without a fight. And the Japanese proved they could be defeated. And since the French are allied to the Americans, the Soviets are perfectly willing to send the Viet Minh weapons and money. And what you get is a long, about 10 years of guerrilla warfare. The Viet Minh know they can't have a battle against the French. They'll get wiped out by the superior firepower. And so they go after supply lines. They go after isolated units. They go after isolated forts. They try to convert the populace or terrorize the populace into supporting them, one or the other. It's right out of literally Mao's playbook. In some ways, it's more sophisticated. It's an addition to Mao's guerrilla war handbook because Giap is actually fighting Western military. He's fighting a French army, whereas Mao fought a Chinese and somewhat Western armed Chinese army. Giap is fighting the French, and a defeated, a humiliated, but an actual Western army. And this is going to end in the culmination of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, one of the great battles of the 20th century in 1954. Basically, the French wanted to fight. So they created a battlefield on a giant plain surrounded by mountains. And the idea was it would bring the Viet Minh army out. It would force them to fight. There's too many French. It was a bait. There's too many French there. They'll want to crush the French. They'll come out. And because there's so many mountains, they won't be able, we can funnel them onto the plain where our superior artillery plus air power will obliterate them. And that didn't happen. In fact, the Vietnamese, through what will later be seen as just an impressive manpower engineering, will actually get over the mountains, will actually occupy the mountains. And so what was supposed to be bait became a siege, became a trap. And it's a disaster. The artillery fighting, the anti-aircraft guns, the French were not able to bring in supplies by air. They weren't able to destroy the Vietnamese army on the mountains, and the French lose, and they are kicked out of Vietnam. Now remember, there's 40,000 French still in Vietnam. What happens to them? They can't be Vietnamese, but they haven't been French in half a century, in 2 generations. So what happens to them? Most will leave, will go back to France, but deep dispossessed, with no money. They've lost their farms, they lost their savings, their families, they've lost their heritage. The Viet Minh have won. And then the United States gets involved and says, nope, 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 and gets involved in the peace treaty to split Vietnam in two. It's also going to break up French Indochina into North and South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So the Viet Minh do not get all the Vietnamese empire. They don't get to recreate 1800 again. Nope. The United States is going to come in and break all these pieces up and try to minimize the communist victory. The French are done. They wash their hands of it. And so here we are. The Americans have gotten involved to backstop the French. First, they were supplying the French, and then the French lost. And it's like, oh, well, let's send the Americans in to do the job. But it's also, we're going to minimize this defeat into the Cold War. Remember, 1954, the Korean War has just ended. So the Soviet Union is on the move. Communist China, Mao has won in China, has been in charge about 10 years or so. No, wait, 1946 to 1949. So Mao has been in charge a couple of years in China. Chiang Kai-shek is exiled in Taiwan. Defeats are everywhere in Asia. And so this is a way of minimizing the defeat. And what it does is it ties the United States to replace the French in South Vietnam, in the southern part of Vietnam. Now remember, we've seen this before. Vietnam has been split along the same line before. You remember the disunion? The Nguyen family in the south, the Trinh in the north. So again, it's like regressing back to like 1600. Breaking Laos and Cambodia away from Vietnam. So that's good if you're Cambodian because you've been dominated by the Vietnamese. It's good if you're Laotian. You've been dominated by the Vietnamese for the last 150 years or so. And the French. But if you're the Vietnamese, you thought you won. You returned back to 1800. The glorious victories of 1800. And it turns out, no. These white dudes from across the ocean, who don't know where Vietnam even is, much less its history, are going to step in and create borders. Well, if you're a nationalist, which the Viet Minh are, well, that does two things. One is, starts a war. We're going to have to unite, at the very least, reunite Vietnam, if not Cambodia and Laos. We're going to have to also get an ally, and that ally is going to be the Soviet Union. Unlike North Korea, remember, Vietnam has an antagonistic relationship with China. Because every time China has come into Vietnam, they've tried to dominate it. And so the Vietnamese have then had a fight to kick them out. Right? That's even true of the Qing, who were asked by the emperor to invade Vietnam to kick out the brothers. Right? But remember that's seen as a foreign invasion to conquer Vietnam. So if you're the Vietnamese, you don't want to ask Mao to come in. So there is an ally. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's the Soviet Union. So the Vietnamese army plus USSR Soviet Union support plus South Vietnamese supporters. There's always South Vietnamese, a lot of South Vietnamese supporters who want a Vietnam for the Vietnamese. They're going to fight against a USA that's sucked in because South Vietnam couldn't defend itself. It's in the video, it's SW. I'm sorry, but South Vietnam. It can't defend itself. It's too corrupt. The governments are military governments, and they're too corrupt. The war in Vietnam is a trauma for everybody involved. It's going to kill 2 million Vietnamese. It's going to destroy whatever was left of the infrastructure that was still standing after the Japanese blew up much of the infrastructure. Bridges, dams, roads. Vietnam was bombed essentially back to the Stone Age in terms of its economic potential. It was traumatic for the United States. I grew up in the generation after Vietnam, and Vietnam dominated everything. I had friends whose fathers had shrines to their Vietnam service in the basement, in a little corner, or in a little room, an alcove. And it was pictures and a flag, of North Vietnamese flag that they captured or took. Various different pictures of their buddies. Maybe a couple of medals. I remember the revanchists of the 80s, all the movies. Are we really going to win this time? Can we refight Vietnam? In the 1980s, boomers wanted to refight Vietnam and win, at least in the movies. The biggest thing that happened was the army was destroyed by 1973. The army, the democratic citizen army that had defeated the Nazis, was ruined between 1965 and 1973. By 1970-71, more United States officers were being killed by their own men than by the Vietnamese. That's an army that fell apart. That's a traumatic event. And so if you take my world civilization course, we talk about the trauma of deindustrialization, of civil rights, of Vietnam, of the 70s, the trauma of the 70s, where you get the 80s. The 80s is the conservatism trying to recover from the trauma of the 70s. So the Vietnam War is bad for everybody. It's terrible for Vietnam. It's worse for Cambodia. And we'll get there. In 1973, the United States leaves. And in 1975, despite the bombings, a final push by the actual army, the Vietnamese army, conquers South Vietnam and unifies the country. So again, for the first time in 150 years or so, or at least 75 years since the French show up in the 1880s, Vietnam is unified again. I might as well, I think we might talk about it a little later, but what happens is it's a trauma for America leaving, but Americans will move on to other things. There's then retribution for all of the trauma that North Vietnamese suffered. So if you allied yourself, if you were a friend of the United States, bad things happened. Your family was maybe arrested or shot. There's a liquidation of American allies in South Vietnam. They're considered traitors for joining with the Westerners. And there's two different mass expulsions of people, whether willingly or not. There's one in the mid-70s and then another one 77, and there's another one in the early 80s of people just fleeing, getting on boats and going to the Philippines or going overland into Thailand as refugees, or basically being either shot or forced to flee. So if you were a pro-American or pro-Western, pro-French South Vietnamese, or I guess even North Vietnamese, bad things happened. But it's even worse in Cambodia. In Cambodia became the most bombed country on earth. First, bombing Vietnamese, who were using it as a safe haven, and then bombing Cambodians during the rise of the Khmer Rouge, the Red Khmer. People hated the bombings, obviously, which means they hated the Americans. Vietnam didn't have an air force. And so that led to support for the Khmer Rouge, the Communist Party in Cambodia that was allied with Mao, which was allied with the CCP, which was allied with the North Vietnamese Communist Party. You know, as enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Khmer Rouge with the Vietnamese army attacked U.S. Cambodian allies in cities, which brought in more bombing because the allies, the Cambodian allies, could not protect themselves. So they called in the bombing. The bombing led to more hatred because this is not precise bombing. No bombing is precise. You end up killing a lot of farmers and a lot of civilians, even if you do kill the guerrillas. And that led to more support for the Khmer Rouge. And by 1973, in 1970, actually, there's an invasion of Cambodia by the United States to kind of clear out the Vietnamese. This just pushed the Khmer Rouge and its Vietnamese allies into Cambodia. By 1973, there's no more American support. America is done with Vietnam. They're done with the money. And so the pro-USA army collapses. Without the bombing, without the money, it collapses. And the Khmer Rouge win in 1975. And then they do something terrifying. They immediately begin depopulating the cities. Now, Vietnam didn't do this. North Korea didn't do this. China didn't do this. Well, I can't say that. There's a bit of it during the Cultural Revolution. That's also during the late 60s into the 70s. But even Shanghai is never depopulated. Cambodian cities are depopulated. Like, not a soul. And what the victory does is the Khmer call it year zero. And what they want to do is the Great Leap Forward, which is forced industrialization, plus the Cultural Revolution, which is a Khmerification of the country at the same time. Which is insane. Because remember, we talked about this. The Great Leap Forward is an economic disaster. It is a humanitarian disaster. Millions of people, maybe 20 to 50 million people starved. Right? And the Cultural Revolution ripped China apart. It obliterated universities. It obliterated learning. It obliterated the cultural artifacts, the heritage of China. It set Chinese culture back by trying to make it pure. To do both at the same time is insane. And that's what the Khmer are doing. They're going to want to return Cambodia back to 1500 again, an agrarian communal paradise. They blame city folk for being enemies and start to murder them. They blame the Westerners, the Western Khmer, for being enemies, and they murder them. And 90% of people own land in Cambodia. It's actually a successful basis for an agricultural revolution, for land ownership, investment, industrialization. Like, it's actually a 90% of people own land. They object, of course, to having the Great Leap Forward collectivization farms put in. So what happens to those? Murder them. The industrialization, the forced industrialization, creates work camps, which become concentration camps on the German USSR model. Which means you murder them. And so we get mass murder in Cambodia. We get a genocide. We get a trauma. We get murder. It is on a scale that's simply unbelievable. We have mass sexual violence. See The Handmaid's Tale, which is Western. It's a Western story about Westerners, but it's essentially what happens to women in Cambodia. They're turned into sex slaves. Because women have to, remember, if you're making Cambodia 1500 again, then all of the changes that happened to women in the last 500 years, you have to get rid of. So how do you enforce that? Through sexual violence or the threat of sexual violence. So you get the men to change women's behavior to protect the women, fathers, husbands. It is so chaotic. It is so traumatic. People flee to Thailand, to Vietnam. It is such an economic disaster with famine and the mass murderings that Vietnam actually had to invade to end the genocide. Now, remember, Vietnam has invaded Cambodia before. It considers Cambodia to be part of the Vietnamese Empire. To protect southern Vietnam, you need to own at least half of Cambodia. So it's not like this is like, oh, I guess we have to own Cambodia. But things were so crazy in Cambodia that Vietnam had to invade. Now, this is part of the Soviet-Chinese breakup. The Vietnamese are Soviet allies. The Cambodians are Chinese allies. And so what happens is China actually invades Vietnam in 1979. This is the Qing invasion in 1800 all over again. And so, Vietnam recreates a Vietnamese empire by conquering Cambodia, stopping the genocide, which is a good thing, and then conquering Laos, which, if you're Laotian, is a bad thing. And then China invades Vietnam in 1979 to put the Khmer back in charge, and the Vietnamese army turns around, marches all the way back to North Vietnam and crushes Mao's army, which had been devastated by the Cultural Revolution. And the Vietnamese army we beat the Americans. They were at the height of their military power, of victory. The result of all of this is that 30% of Cambodians were murdered. 30%. Cambodia goes from being a relatively rich, stable place to poor. It did well under the French. Cambodia is a good farmland. It should be rich. It should be well off. Thailand takes in refugees and turns them into slave labor. Or, in some cases, returns them to be shot. Because the Thais don't want trouble. Don't want a war on their border. And all these refugees, these starving refugees, are coming into their country. Well, how are we going to put up with them? Now remember, Thailand, Siam, owned Cambodia for large parts of this course. And so turning them back into slaves, not exactly anti-historical. And the Thais, remember, their competitors aren't Cambodia. Their competitors are Vietnam. The Vietnamese have just taken over Cambodia, so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the Khmer Rouge actually became a Chinese and American ally. Because the Americans are mad about Vietnam and want to fight the Vietnamese. So this is the craziness that the United States actually became unofficially an ally of a genocidal, crazy-ass communist party regime. So it is awful for Cambodia. So Vietnam, 1980 to 1989. They are a poor client state of the USSR. They are a dictatorship. Why is this bad? Well, just as Vietnam is winning, their ally is falling apart. The Soviet Union is the closed economic system. It's clearly unable to keep up with the West in Europe. It's not economically, in many cases, able even to put bread on the table. It's run in the early 80s until Mikhail Gorbachev is able to take over by a bunch of Stalinist old men who are completely, like, they want to make it 1950 again, and it's just not going to happen. And so since Soviet Russia, since the USSR is poor, all of their allies are going to be poor. There's no money to give them. And Vietnam is not Eastern Europe. Like, if you had $100, where is most of it going to go? It's going to go to Eastern Europe. You know, most of it's going to stay in the Soviet Union. Then your big chunk of what's left goes to Eastern Europe. Cuba. You have to keep Cuba because Cuba gets to poke around the United States and Central America and such. So keep that Cold War going. You have a couple of allies in Africa you got to support, and then there's Vietnam. So it's a poor client state of the USSR. It's a dictatorship. After 1991, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of communism. You can't be communist anymore. There's no one to pay you. You have to deal with the United States. So that made diplomacy with the West. So they have to give up their empire. They give up Laos and Cambodia, which become independent countries. And what they take on is Chinese-style socialist capitalism. Why? It seems to be working in China. Remember, we talked about this, that China had a revolution after the Tiananmen Square. It was, we'll make you rich, or at least we'll make you better off if you don't revolt. You leave the Chinese Communist Party in charge, and we will make sure the economy grows enough that you make money. You'll have stability, we'll have power, you'll have stability, and you'll make money. That's the deal in China. And so Vietnam, the Vietnamese leaders, who are Soviet Union communists, seeing the implosion of the Soviet Union, look at that and go, woo, maybe China's not so bad. And so they start with low-wage labor in Western factories. And that's going to be their move towards modernization. They are going to produce goods for Western companies at very low wages. Actually competing with the Chinese for low wages. China's rise, as we'll talk about in the China as a superpower, equals Vietnam actually became a friend of the United States. The trauma of the Vietnam War actually means there is a large tourism of boomers who, whether they fought or they protested or they just lived through the era of going to Vietnam. It's Anthony Bourdain's, one of Anthony Bourdain's favorite places to eat. China's rise made Vietnam, because Vietnam, remember, is anti-Chinese. Despite taking on the economic, political kind of, hey, inspiration, they don't want China to dominate Vietnam. They've never wanted that. We've talked that this entire class is Vietnam trying to avoid that situation. And so Vietnam actually becomes a friend in the United States. And the United States needs friends. It's got Japan and South Korea. Everybody else is more or less up for grabs. In Taiwan, everybody else is up for grabs with the rise of China. Now there's Thailand, and there's the Philippines. You got a 50 years of history there with the Philippines. It's 100 years of history as an ally of America. And so, but can a rich China buy those friends? Maybe. Certainly in Cambodia, certainly Laos. These are not the strongest of allies for the United States. There's no real long history. In Cambodia, it's actually antagonistic. You know, so there's less soft power. Indonesia's is kind of the same. You know, the United States supported a lot of dictators in Indonesia. So can China step in there? Maybe. But in Vietnam, there's no chance. Or there shouldn't be one. Vietnamese history is they need a friend who can help them balance off China. So the United States has it in there. And so since 1991, the United States has actually been, despite the 80s all wanting Rambo to refight Vietnam and win it again and defeat the Vietnamese communists, the Communist Party is still in charge of Vietnam. And they have a friend in the United States. So that's where we'll end. Thank you.